buenos días. Estamos una vez más con ustedes en un evento en el marco del proyecto PAPIT sobre deliberación y comunicación política. En esta ocasión tenemos la gran fortuna de contar con un gran académico de la Universidad de Warwick y él es experto en representación, entre otros temas. Ha publicado varios libros, ya vamos a ahorita hablar de su semblanza, pero bueno, lo que quería comentarles es que este es resultado del apoyo de varias personas, de miembros del seminario Perspectiva Democrática, del propio Instituto de Investigaciones Sociales, de la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y del posgrado. Y el interés primordial en cuanto al tema es vincular ciertos procesos políticos a un tema que nos interesa mucho, que es el de la deliberación, en su vínculo con prácticas de comunicación política. Y bueno, pues sin más, le doy la bienvenida a Sauer y también le doy la palabra a Silvia Inclán, investigadora del Instituto de Investigaciones Sociales, quien nos acompaña y nos llevará a cabo la moderación, y después también tendremos la participación del doctor Fernando Castaños, quien hará comentarios. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Iván. Bienvenidos a todos. Como mencionaba Iván Islas, tenemos hoy la presencia del doctor Michael Sauer y los comentarios del doctor Fernando Castaños para el seminario del día de la sesión del seminario del día de hoy. El profesor Michael Sauer es profesor de Política y Relaciones Internacionales en la Universidad de Warwick, donde ha ocupado distintos cargos como académico directivos en el Centro de Entrenamiento Doctoral y en Educación Abierta, pero y también como profesor y como investigador. Y su principal tema de investigación es la teoría democrática contemporánea, pero recientemente ha enfocado su trabajo en la teoría de la representación, donde tiene importantes y muy numerosas publicaciones recientes, pero es un tema que él viene trabajando desde antes, desde el 2013, en un libro de Cambridge University Press que se llama Enacting European Citizenship, con financiamiento de un proyecto del ENACT, donde incluyó líderes y activistas y académicos europeos, y más recientemente su libro The Representative Claim, que fue publicado por Oxford University Press y fue distinguido con el premio George H. Hallett de la American Political Science Association en 2020. También tiene otro libro muy importante en este tema de la representación, que se llama Making Representations, del European Consortium for Political Research, que fue publicado también en 2020. Y bueno, ha estado trabajando en el tema de diseño democrático, también donde ha contado con el apoyo de una beca del Leverhulme Trust desde el 2013 hasta el 2019, de lo cual produjo también otro importante libro de Oxford University Press intitulado Democratic Design, que acaba de publicar en enero de 2021. Y bueno, además, junto con sus colegas con su colega de la Universidad de Warwick, Shirin Rai, y sus colegas de el Warwick Theatre and Performance, es coautor del Oxford Handbook of Politics and Performance. Y bueno, pues actualmente sigue trabajando varios temas, incluyendo actuación y representación democrática y el rol de las ideas políticas en la práctica, en la vida política. Entonces, pues es para nosotros un honor, un gusto tener al doctor Sauer el día de hoy con nosotros. Professor Sauer, be very welcome. It is an honor to have you here with us today. Please.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. Good to see you and all of your colleagues again. Thank you, Ivan, in particular, for the invitation for this event. I apologize again for the slightly messy beginning, which was to do with questions of international timing. I hope you can see my slides, and if so, I shall commence them. What I thought I would do in the context of the brief description of the citizen consultation exercise, which Ivan has communicated to me about, which is a part of this seminar project, I thought I would step back a little bit from giving you a specific academic paper. I've already had, fortunately, the opportunity to speak to many colleagues here on the call about my work on democratic design, which Sylvia just mentioned, some of my work on theories of representation. So I thought I would step back from that just to reflect a little more generally and in a slightly more informal way about some of the questions which are not always asked, but I think need to be asked. Whenever we were looking at what I will broadly refer to as democratic innovations, efforts to deepen or extend democracy in many varied particular contexts in different countries all around the world. And clearly you have a specific case and a specific challenge in front of you in Mexico City. So perhaps there is a kind of quiet democratic transformation happening around the world. And if so, this may be happening under the radar of electoral democracy. Because electoral democracy, as we know, is suffering in many places great pressures from populist, sometimes overtly racist, far-right parties and movements. Multiple countries, multiple localities are nevertheless experimenting with new forms of deliberation and participation. We're familiar in different ways with, for example, citizens' assemblies, participatory budgets, and all of these come in different shapes and different sizes. Policy co-creation, policy collaborations, and so on. The creators and promoters of these innovations are enthusiastic, they are often ambitious, and mainstream political parties and political leaders are often disdainful, looking down on these efforts to innovate with new institutions. So how will this complex picture for democracy evolve? Well, we will see. We are just in the midst of it at the moment. Now, your particular case in Mexico City concerns recent citizen consultations. I'm quoting key terms back to Ivan and colleagues now. So just in this conversational mode, let's look at some of the concepts involved here. So citizens are, as I understand it, consulted by government agencies or agents. Dialogue and deliberation are involved, or at least they are encouraged, among a number of communicative practices, another of your terms. There are mechanisms, there are processes, there are practices and decision-making. These are all concepts that are invoked and things that are implicated, things that are advocated. Understandings of what democracy is and what it demands of us are, it seems to me, woven through these moments or these features. Direct democracy, deliberative, participative, and other adjectives. So these, it seems to me, I've picked up from the little I know, these appear to be the key terms of the study of these citizen consultations in Mexico City. Now, for a research project like this, you may disagree with me. We're going to have an interesting discussion in a bit, but for a project like this, there are difficult, pressing questions to be asked. And so my focus here will be on, as my title suggests, 8 conceptual questions. And even though they're conceptual, they are tangled with institutional questions as well. So my overarching question is that to study these developments in Mexico City and other initiatives like them, what are the key conceptual and therefore also practical questions that need to be asked? And so this is where my 8 questions will come in. I would just like to pause for one moment to make sure there's a bit of noise at my end with traffic and so on, that you can hear me and see the slides okay. Now, the wider frame around these concepts and this sort of focus in research is often expressed as democratic innovations. I've already started using that phrase in this talk. So what are democratic innovations? So for Graham Smith, in his book, which is called Democratic Innovations, says that they are, and I'm quoting, institutions that have been specifically designed to increase and deepen citizen participation in the political decision-making process. Okay. Ken Newton defines democratic innovation slightly differently, and I quote again. He says it is the successful implementation of a new idea that is intended to change the structures or processes of democratic government and politics in order to improve them. So these 2 authors take a wide view, a quite expansive view of democratic innovations. Their definitions encompass, for example, innovations in citizen participation, direct democracy, and representation. The range of examples or types of democratic innovation that would fit these definitions is potentially very large. I suspect that a number of you in this meeting are aware of the Participedia website. I didn't put the website up there, but I think it's participedia.net, which is, as far as I can tell, is the best and most extensive website that offers a kind of searchable range, an extraordinary searchable range of democratic innovations at local, regional, and national level around the world. That certainly gives a sense of the huge variety. However, the notion of democratic innovations prompts us to ask as many questions as these definitions answer. And so I turn to the first of my 8 questions. And I again emphasize, I think these 8 questions, some perhaps more important than others, are questions that I ask myself and I encourage others to ask of any project that looks empirically or conceptually at a process of innovating in democracy. So the first question, what is new? Think of Newton's definition earlier. He used the word new, something that is new. So what is new? What does new mean? And what by implication is old or perhaps established? in terms of our ideas of democracy. So, for example, direct democracy is very old. We used to teach until recently that direct democracy was invented in ancient Greece and more specifically ancient Athens. Well, that has since been disputed if you read the work of John Keane, for example, but I leave that to one side. So are we reviving? Are we redesigning? Or are we coming up with new things? And there is also a rhetoric of newness, sometimes perhaps a slightly misleading rhetoric of novelty and innovation, newness, amongst advocates and enthusiasts for different sorts of democratic innovation. My second question, are innovations restricted to developments or changes that deepen participation or bring improvements? So different authors in this academic field tend to argue that innovations supplement rather than replace the familiar institutions of liberal representative democracy. So this in turn raises questions about the timing, the location, and varied aspects of the size or scope, perhaps the ambition of any given innovation. How much does an innovation intend to change, to displace, to supplement, to replace, to coordinate with what currently exists in institutional and other terms? Which leads through indeed to my third question. What degree of disruption, how much disruption, supplementation, or indeed innovation, newness, invention may be involved? So I think these first three questions press us to think about how innovations may fit into a wider picture of democratic governance and its design. Just as a kind of aside, there is a lot of discussion and a lot of research funded in the European Union at the moment, which is a problem after Brexit because we in Britain can't get our hands on that money so easily anymore. That's a complex difficulty, which I mentioned because I'm consumed by it, but I will now push it to one side. But a lot of the focus of the funding there is on, frankly, citizens' assemblies. There's not much talk about the context, the institutional fit, whether you can scale up innovations like this from local to regional or nation-state levels. Arguably, there's too much focus on a particular democratic innovation or a particular innovative institution as kind of solving the problems of democracy, solving the problems of democratic participation, but looking at these institutions too much in isolation from others. I move on to my question 4. What understanding of the meanings of democracy lies behind the research? Any project, including this Mexico City one. What conceptions of democracy are lurking or hovering in the research? Singular or multiple meanings of democracy? Meanings that come out of academic work or meanings that arise from, are articulated by the lived experiences of participants themselves? So this, of course, is back to the basic question. What is democracy? And that question carries a lot of historical and theoretical baggage, as we say. What does even asking that question imply? What does it say about our approach? And I think there are two main approaches here. There are two main ways one can think about what it means to ask, what is democracy? The first one is that the question implies that democracy has a meaning. And by the way, it has one meaning. It has a best meaning. On this approach, it must mean something, and probably just one thing in the end. It also implies that we need this definition. The phenomenon of democracy is important, it's valuable, we need a definition of it. Otherwise, why even ask the question? Maybe this first approach also implies that there is someone who can or should do the job of definition. A theorist of democracy, maybe, or some other political scientist or political sociologist. So under this first approach, meanings and models will be few, possibly singular. But there is, I think, a second approach to the question of definition. And this second approach is that the question, what is democracy, points to something like, what has democracy meant? What might it mean? Not what does it mean, what might, what could it mean? So this second approach implies that it's important for us to know what people have made of democracy, this thing, democracy, or what they have made and could make with the idea. On the second approach, democracy may well mean things in the plural, and lots of different people, lots of different groups may have different conceptions or different answers to the question. Meanings on this second approach will be multiple. Multiple definitions that perhaps don't sit alongside each other comfortably, that they are not commensurable, as the theorists say. And leaving open the possibility that there could be many different, perhaps competing models of democracy. So this second kind of approach prompts a thought that perhaps we should only consider concepts that are produced organically by the actors involved. Perhaps in your Mexico City case, by people who are being citizens, who are being potentially consulted. What conception of democracy, implicit or explicit, is in their minds and in their discussions and in their experiences? And in some ways, that kind of question, the thought behind my question 4, is about what do we think we are doing when we are researching these things? Are we also co-creators of the meanings, of the concepts which are at work? Not least, of course, the concept of democracy itself. So my question 5. This is the representation question. When studying almost any context where democracy is being disputed, proposed, new plans and new designs are being made for it, and so on, who speaks for whom? Who speaks to whom? In creating or animating or performing democratic functions and roles? Who speaks for whom? Who acts for whom? What stands for whom? And with what degree of authority or legitimacy? If any of you have been brave or foolhardy enough to read some of my work or work of some others who are part of the so-called constructivist school of representation studies, you will see that there is an argument that representation is a contingent matter. It's a contingent matter of claims to speak or to stand for others. And indeed, the contestation of those claims. Who has the right to speak for whom? Do citizens have the right to speak for other citizens because they are citizens? Do facilitators of democratic innovations have the right to speak for citizens or for others in government? Does that right appear authoritative or acceptable to others involved in the process? These are some of the kind of sub-questions of the representation question. So the kind of framework around the notion of representation being about contested claims emphasizes the kind of contextual dynamics, the situatedness of producing representation. Representation, claims of representation are produced out of particular contexts, actions, and practices. They are not something that we can carry our concept and lay it like a map over a context just to try and make sense of it from above, as it were. And there's one element of this that I think I would highlight as well, that this kind of approach, this approach to representation that stresses its contingency, its dynamism, highlights the kind of aesthetic and the cultural character of representations. People who wish to be representative or to be treated as representatives, spokespersons or advocates of others, need to make representations. They need to present themselves, they need to perform, they need to appear publicly. And they need to make representations of their constituents in order to try and get citizens or constituents to recognize them as representatives. I'll move on to my question 6. This is the empowerment question. So question 6 is, who is empowered and who is disempowered by pursuing democratic innovation through different frames? So if the frame, and this appears to be the case in the Mexico City example, if the frame is consultation, on the face of it, this word does not imply citizen or participant empowerment. On the face of it, it doesn't imply that. Or at least empowerment in a process of consultation cannot be assumed. If the frame is something different, if the frame is, for example, deliberation, which I know is also a notion at work in the Mexico City case, if it's deliberation, empowerment of citizens or participants may depend on their links with decision-making centers in some formal way. Citizens may have the opportunity to deliberate in a formal or semi-formal context of governance, but is anyone in power obliged to listen to them? Is anyone in power obliged to act upon their perspectives or recommendations, and so on? The frame, on the other hand, might be participation. But the same sorts of considerations or questions would apply. Is it empowered participation or is it not? How? And with regard to participation, this is the sort of concern that led people like Fung and Wright in their work, which included work on participatory budgeting in Brazil, to coin the term empowered participatory governance. They insist on the word empowered being in there. I move to my question 7, and since I've only got 8 questions, Ivan, I hope if I spill over time slightly, you will tolerate me. My question 7: what happens when there are tensions or clashes between prescriptions of different adjectives or qualifiers of democracy? What happens when we're giving a lot of importance to the word consultation, but it clashes with ideas of representation in this context? What happens when ideas of representation clash with ideas of participation? What if all of these key terms, representation, participation, deliberation, and so on, express ambitions or plans in a particular context of democratic change, but they don't sit easily with each other? The institutional changes or the changes in practice that might follow from one of these guides, one of these frames, may clash or be in tension with those of others. So on this question 7, consider, for example, there's a couple of quotes. Hopefully you can read them okay on the screen. So consider first, for example, tensions between the participative and deliberative. A quote there from an extremely well-known, of course, well-established theorist of democracy and feminism, Carol Pateman, in her, I think the article was in American Political Science Review in 2010, and I think it was her presidential address. I think at the time she was president of the APSA. And she wrote, "Participatory democracy, I argue, is different from deliberative democracy. Deliberation, discussion, and debate," she says, "are central to any form of democracy, including participatory democracy. But if deliberation is necessary for democracy, it is not sufficient. Some of the more enthusiastic advocates of deliberative democracy tend to present deliberation as if it were synonymous with democracy itself." Another well-established, unfortunately since departed American democratic theorist, Benjamin Barber, had similar thoughts and wrote about them in different contexts. Secondly, think about representative deliberative tensions. Mark Brown, for example, has written, and the quote is there before you, that representation makes things difficult for deliberative democracy. It's relatively easy, he says, to argue that democracy should involve more and better deliberation. But it's much less clear whether and how deliberators should stand for, speak for, or act for those who are not present, that is, not present in the deliberations. Now, some of these tensions, at least, can be addressed. And I'm quite interested in work that attempts to address some of them. I think, for example, of the work of David Plotky in a much cited article going back a few years now, where he addresses a supposed tension, and some people regard it as a kind of classical tension, between participation and representation in ideas of democracy. And he wrote that representation has a central positive role in democratic politics. I gain political representation when my authorized representative tries to achieve my political aims, subject to dialogue about those aims and to the use of mutually acceptable procedures for gaining them. Thus, the opposite of representation, he says, is not participation. The opposite of representation is exclusion. And the opposite of participation is abstention. rather than opposing participation to representation, we should try to improve representative practices and forms to make them more open, effective, and fair. And so finally, I move to my final question 8, which I refer to as the institution or system question. And this goes back to the comment I made about the European Union democracy research funding context I noted earlier. So studies of institutional design, that's a phrase to think about, isn't it? A very common phrase, at least in English. I don't know if the Spanish equivalent is so common in political science, but studies of institutional design have focused mostly on single institutions. Deliberative forums are very popular, and I noted earlier that citizens' assemblies, that form in particular, is very popular amongst facilitators of democratic designs, popular amongst academics, and popular in the Commission of the European Union, as it happens at the moment. Sometimes the focus is more on referendums, for example, but there tends to be a focus mostly on single sorts of institutions. But interestingly, work on deliberative democracy has, as many of you will be well aware, moved away from single institutions and taken on a so-called systemic turn, a turn towards the system rather than the single institution. My own work on what I call the democratic design framework is very firmly focused on the systemic level rather than the single institutional level. In the words of Jane Mansbridge, thinking about systemic versions of deliberative democracy, she seeks to move beyond analysis which are focused only on individual sites of deliberation and to turn to the interdependence of sites within a larger system. And so the proponents of more systemic views, especially in the deliberative democracy literature, are looking for an approach which, in Mansbridge's words, enables us to think about democratic decisions being taken in the context of a variety of deliberative venues and deliberative institutions, interacting together to produce a healthy deliberative system. And I think in that kind of statement, you can substitute the word democratic for deliberative. So again, in any kind of study that focuses on a particular plans, innovations, struggles for consultation or participation, such as in Mexico City, is there a focus on a single institutional innovation, or is there somehow also a focus on the place of that institution and the contribution of that institution to a larger revised way of practicing democracy, a more systemic way? Now, if we locate innovations and designs of democracy at a more systemic level, that does beg the question, what exactly is the systemic or the system? What practices and other phenomena fit into it and which do not? And I think there's a simple distinction there, which I won't go into in detail. I'll finish up. We don't have to think of an entire societal system. We don't need to think in terms of Talcott Parsons or Nicholas Luhmann and think about systems that are society-wide and all-encompassing. I think I'm referring here mostly to something slightly narrower, but still complex and difficult to deal with, the systemic governmental system. institutions and practices of governance as constituting a system. So, those are my 8 questions. Some of these might be more productive to ask than others when it comes to your specific focus in Mexico City. But I think up to a point, finding answers or thinking about potential answers to these sorts of questions might help to clarify to yourselves what you are doing and what others are doing in this case. Why you were using certain concepts and not others, how you were using them. And equally important, it might help to pose questions about what you are not doing. So thank you very much, and I will leave that there.
Thank you very much, Professor Saward, for this interesting presentation and questions. I will give now the microphone to Dr. Fernando Castaños for a discussion or answer to the questions, maybe. Professor Castaños, please.
Thank you. Thank you very
Fernando,
much.
if you could answer all the questions, Fernando, that would be excellent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ivan. Thank you very much, Sylvia. Thank you very, very much, Michael. You're asking us to take a few steps back and think about what you've said about democratic design and about representation. And you're also asking us to think back about what we believe regarding deliberation, participation, and political communication. This is quite a challenge. I would will take some time, but it's a very interesting challenge, and I will try to start thinking about these matters. I'm not capable at this moment of going through all your 8 questions one by one, but I hope I will be able to keep them as a backdrop when I think about what you're asking us to think and what I am motivated to think when seeing your questions. And I want to start with deliberation. I want to think about Pateman's view. The deliberation is necessary but not sufficient. Why is it necessary and why is it not sufficient? And perhaps if we start from there, I can begin connecting all the other issues. When one deliberates, one asks to be treated fairly. When one deliberates, and because one deliberates, one asks for fairness. And by so doing, one commits to being fair to others as well. This is the reason that deliberation has always been necessary and has always been thought of as necessary for democracy, although it hasn't always been recognized as such. In fact, for a long time, democratic theory did not name deliberation and did not focus on it. It was implicit in demands for freedom of opinion, in demands for equilibrium and checks between powers. But the next point would be that one wants to be treated fairly, not only by those in power, but equally, if not more importantly, by those who do not have power. One wants to be judged by those who do not have interests in power. And one values the judgment of third parties more than the judgment of those in power. This makes deliberation an ideal. You will never have perfect deliberation. But if you don't have that ideal, then abuse of power is more frequent and more ominous. So deliberation is necessary because it sets and incarnates the ideal of fairness. Why is it not sufficient? Because perfect deliberation would have to be complete deliberation, and that would require an infinite amount of time, which nobody has. But it is also insufficient because it can never be pure. For somebody to deliberate with others, it is necessary that certain communicative conditions be established. And those are not established by deliberation itself and cannot be established by deliberation itself. You need other modes of discursive interaction for deliberative conditions to emerge and be maintained. You need negotiation, for example, and you need instruction. It is hard to admit it, but you also need instruction. For a proper deliberative body to operate, you need a moderator or conductor or secretary or president or whatever. You need someone to give the microphone to others, as Sylvia said. Turn-taking is not turn-taking is part of the regulatory conditions that make deliberation possible, but it is not guaranteed by deliberation itself and cannot be guaranteed by deliberation itself. Putting it more simply, you need access to the fora or forums, I don't know which plural you prefer. You need access to the different forums where deliberation takes place, and that cannot be produced by deliberation itself. This takes me to question 8, which I will start considering, and I will try to go back to it afterwards. You need a tense equilibrium for deliberation to take place. You need deliberation to make room for negotiation and instruction. The problem, of course, is that when somebody is empowered by negotiation or is empowered by instruction, especially when somebody is empowered by instruction, he or she, they will be tempted to break that equilibrium. And they will be tempted to give momentum to a spiral where instruction becomes overriding or negotiation becomes overriding. At least in Mexico's long transition to democracy, in Mexico's long liberation before the transition, the political system in Mexico took 20 years of liberation, with lots of ups and downs, selective repression, non-access to media, non-access to other forums. At the same time that the ideal started growing and representation started changing so that it could make room for deliberation. 20 years of the liberalization process, 12 years for the transition process. That was 32 long years to get out from the hegemonic one-party system. We are now 20 years into democracy, and it's not improving. It's getting worse. In fact, the possibility of going back to a one-party hegemonic, non-democratic system is growing every day. And what we saw in that democratization trajectory and what we are seeing in this erosion of democracy trajectory is that the tension between deliberation on the one hand and negotiation and instruction on the other is central. It is perhaps more important than other tensions in the systemic operation of democracy, or at least it's the most symptomatic one. Perhaps there are other tensions that are not so visible, and if they're a system, they must be important. But this was the problem, and this is beginning to be the problem again. Now, I would like to go back and offer an operational definition of deliberation. One problem with deliberative democracy, one reason that it is sometimes thought of as a subtype of democracy rather than one dimension that is necessary for all democracies, and one reason it is not possible as a perfect mode of discursive interaction is that we do not have very good operational definitions of it. We know what we want. We want fairness, but people have defined deliberation operationally, assuming that you can have very extensive and very good deliberation, and not focusing on this issue that Bateman focuses on: necessary but not sufficient. Among the different operational definitions that people have offered is that when people deliberate, they change their minds and eventually reach the best possible outcome. They approximate. Deliberation for them is a means of gradual approximation from different points of view towards the best solution. If you want fairness, and if fairness is the basis, is one of the central objectives of democratic resistance, of democratic struggle, of democratic innovation, you want to go perhaps a little further and a little before the idea of having changes of mind as the operational definition. When I ask for fairness, because I deliberate, I commit myself to deliberation. I commit myself to being fair to others. And this is the basis for the emergence of a moral obligation to abide by the law. And that moral obligation among citizens is the basis for the state's authority to impose the law. The rule of law is legitimate and democratic if it is based on a minimum construction of options by deliberation. The rule of law is authoritarian, is not democratic if it is not based on deliberation. The same happens with other the institutional dimensions and elements of the traditional definitions of democracy. I hope I'm not taking too much time, but I'll try to hurry up.
You still have 6 minutes.
Okay. You need deliberation because it is necessary to produce democratic legitimacy. If I ask to be fair, and if that commits myself to being fair to others, then I will have to accept the results. I will have to accept the decisions, even if I don't like them, or even if I don't agree with them. If I'm not taking into account, I won't have to accept the decisions. In Spain, to put a bomb to the main figures in government was legitimate during the dictatorship, because what they were doing was not legitimate. After Spain's transition to democracy, putting a bomb to representatives or government officials is not legitimate, because what they do is legitimate, even if you don't like it. That's the reason you need a deliberation. If you erode deliberation below a certain level, then the whole system becomes non-legitimate. Looking at it from that point of view, the operational definition we need is this: deliberation takes place when actors take into account the premises of others. The problem with the previous definitions, operational definitions of democracy, is focusing on the outcome. You have to focus on the process. Deliberation is taking into account the premises of others. And is your premises being taken into account? That's what produces the moral obligation to obey the law. That's what produces legitimacy. And doing so requires that we distinguish. This is sometimes done. It wasn't done in the beginning, but we need to distinguish between deliberation as part of the decision-making process, but not as the decision-taking moment. You have to distinguish between constructing the options and deciding on those options. You have to decide by majority, by qualified majority, by simple majority. You have to decide in other ways. Sometimes individuals have to be responsible for the decision. And if they are not responsible, then the whole system collapses. So one thing is deciding in one way or deciding in another. And another thing is how you construct the options. That's the what you want in democratic innovation. You want deliberation to be the engine that allows for different premises, including value premises, including interests, but of course, epistemic premises. You want to know whether that is possible or not, whether that is costly or not. And normative premises, you want to know whether that is right or wrong according to the existing rules that allow for all this to happen. I agree that looking at it this way, representation is not the antonym of participation, but the opposite of exclusion. And abstention is the opposite of participation. If you elect a representative, you are participating to some extent, as much as you wish. You also want that these systemic rules allow you to participate in other ways, and not only through your electing a representative. But if we look at it this way, representation and participation have to be also in equilibrium. They also have to be part of the tense system of equilibria that produces the global equilibrium and make democracy resilient. Sometimes participation can disbalance representation if participation is misused to undermine deliberation. I will try to finish with one or two sentences. Sylvia is telling me that I have 1 minute. I will go back to your initial questions, especially your fourth question, your third and fourth questions. Democracy has to be potentially innovative. If democracy cannot be innovated, and if it cannot innovate itself, then it stops being democracy because it precludes deliberation completely. But and there's also something else you mentioned here. Disputing the regime from the regime itself involves the possibility of controverting the notion. Democracy is a essentially controversial notion, as Gali said, because if you cannot discuss what it means for you, then it's very difficult to innovate and to allow for fairness. But if it is controversial, and if people argue about it, and if the argument has consequences in the institutional and the systemic designs, it is because the opposition between singular and multiple is also a false polarity. You need to think, and people do think, that there is one notion that society accepts as such, a society, not individuals. And you also need to think that if there's something better, it will also be one for society. So democracy, even if you accept that different individuals have different notions, and that's why they're disputing the notion and the regime, cannot be thought of as a relative arrangement. For the multiplicity to exist and to be meaningful and to be motivating, people need to think that there is something singular about it. I'll finish there. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Castaños. We will open now the floor for questions and discussion with the rest of the members of the seminar and our guests. It has been quite interesting. The set of questions, I think you opened even more questions. So I'll open up the floor. Maybe you can raise your hand if you want to place a question. I don't see any hands right now or any questions in the chat already. Okay, Gabriela, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Inclán. Thank you very much, Dr. Sauer, Dr. Castaños, Ivan. Thank you very much. It has been very interesting to hear about this. I have a question about why do you think to Deliberation is getting a charge of a question about it does not have enough representation. Why are others taking the decisions for me? If this situation is not concluded even for representation, there are other people taking deliberation for decisions for us, even if we did not vote for them. But this is not a cause that is implied to democracy, to representative democracy, but it is implied for the deliberative democracy. Why is that, do you think? Thank you very much. I hope to be clear, to have been clear.
I think we can take more questions, or you want to answer right away. I think it's better if we take more questions, if someone else has one. Yes, Alejandro, please.
Yes, thank you very much, all of you. It's been quite delicious to hear. It's a very simple question and something I had been thinking around and around, because as a sociologist, I like to wonder how things really work. And one of my concerns is, what should we observe first, or we give more importance when studying deliberation? From one side, we can think about institutional design, which the institutionals arrange systems, spaces, arenas, incentivate people to deliberate, to generate some climate, to having a discussion and arguing for the common good. And for the other hand, intention, we can think about some, I don't know if psychological, cultural, idiosyncratic attributes of the individual, of the person, that we can frame perhaps as political or civic culture, that are important to get deliberation started. And I think that's an empirical tension we have to take account of if we want to map and measure deliberation. It's more like an existential doubt, more than a comment, more than a reflection. But I would like you to go through this because it's something that has been crossing my mind.
Okay, thank you, Alejandro. Luis Manuel, please.
Thank you, Dr. Michael Sauer. I just have one question. I would like to know what's your opinion or what you think about the new in digitalization. What could be the role of technology, particularly information and communication technologies, for improving deliberation and more generally the systemic democratic design? Thank you.
Thank you. Fernando, you have a question, or you would like to go ahead and start?
I would like to go ahead so that Mike can react to what I'm thinking.
Okay.
I think in this case, what he has to say will be more important than what I want to say.
Okay, yeah, let's then give the word back to Professor Sauer.
No, I was saying I would like to.
You would like to react first?
To react so that he can then react to what I say.
Okay, okay.
If that's possible, if that's possible, yeah.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I want to take the opportunity that he's here and ask him to give us an opinion of what I have to say. Trying to answer or to lay some foundations to answer Gabriela and Alejandro and Luis Manuel. I was saying that deliberation cannot provide all the conditions for it to thrive, and sometimes not even for itself to exist. One mode of discursive interaction that is crucial in politics is the selection of themes, is the hierarchization of what matters, what deserves to be deliberated and what does not. And I would like to connect this with Ivan's and his team's concerns. Public communication and political communication are constrained by the systemic design Mike was talking about, and some forms of political communication and some forms of public communication are facilitated by those systems. Part of the advance of democracy and part of the erosion of democracy has to do with how the whole system allows for themes to be introduced, allows for access of themes, and for the hierarchization of themes. This is something that is known for a long time, and we don't pay enough attention to it. This is one of the key elements in Goebbels' 11 recommendations to the Nazi government. He said, when you don't have arguments, change the theme. When you think you have arguments and when the other people don't have access to produce their arguments, repeat your theme. So there is a problem of thematization that democratic design has to address. And it is when your themes are excluded that you have the impression Gabriela has. You are not being taken into account. If your themes are not taken into account, how can your predicates be taken into account? How can your premises about those predicates be taken into account? That's the easiest and most common way of exclusion, controlling the agenda, setting the agenda. I leave it there. And that's why consultation was important at one moment in Mexico City. And that's why I think Ivan took it as a focus of his project. Consultation opens up the forum for themes that the government was not prepared to discuss at that moment. Sorry.
Okay, thank you, Professor Castaños. I think, as we said, I'm going to let Professor Sauer respond to your comments and to the first three questions, and then we will go back to you, Ivan, right? You want to place a question. Okay, Professor Sauer, please.
Thank you, everybody. There is so much on the table there that I will not be able to do justice to half of it. That's my excuse anyway. And I'm glad, Ivan, that you will say something in a moment, because in thinking about what are the most troubling sorts of questions that often we, a general we there, don't ask when we're looking at any context, any specific context of democratic change or innovation. I was reflecting off the kind of 2 or 3 page outline of the specific project in Mexico City you have in mind. So I hope I didn't mischaracterize it in some way. I was really interested in the fact that the words deliberation, direct democracy, consultation, and participation, all of these terms were in there. And that's not a criticism, that richness, that kind of adjectival richness struck me. So what you might make of that, Ivan, I think would be interesting. Fernando, I enjoyed your kind of panoramic reflection on deliberation and its role and potential character. I can't disagree with anything you've said. That was very erudite. I liked the fact, just one instance, you stress fairness as a kind of constituent and an essential ingredient of effective deliberation, democratic deliberation. And of course, one of the roots of the idea of deliberative democracy that has become so strong in thinking about democracy in recent decades was John Rawls' A Theory of Justice. And Rawls, of course, describes his theory of justice as fairness. And fairness, in Rawls's terms, was embodied, of course, in the ideal deliberation, which is the deliberation that occurs in the original position behind the veil of ignorance, which, of course, was a hypothetical thought experiment, not ever intended to reflect something that could be constructed for real. I give a nod to Habermas as well as a root, but anyway, I enjoyed that. And in some ways, what you present, Fernando, is a picture where deliberation must be conceived of in the right normative terms, constructed in the right way, and not least, positioned or located within a larger system in the right ways. Otherwise, it's in trouble. Otherwise, it may not be fair. Otherwise, it may not be reasonable deliberation somehow focused on common goods, or where people leave their very particular, perhaps selfish interests at the door as they enter the metaphorical deliberative chamber. And I think just a couple of the things that emphasizes about how we think about democratic reform and institutional democratic change is that a systemic view, whatever that is exactly, is incredibly important. How do different institutions link up? How do the old ones and the new ones we're thinking about link up? How do different people in power and out of power see them linking? Who's setting the agenda and who's deciding? I'm just kind of repeating back in different terms things that you've emphasized, I think, Fernando. The systemic view is complicated, but that really matters. That really matters. Now, the systemic take in deliberative democracy, I've been very critical of. I'm not alone in this. I've been very critical of this because it's kind of a way of rescuing deliberation as the adjective for democracy. It ain't democracy if it's not deliberative. Kind of rescuing that by saying, well, even non-deliberative institutions can be encompassed within a larger kind of systemic order. And at that point, my thought, my simple thought, is why are we calling it deliberative democracy now? Why is that not just called democracy? And deliberation should find its appropriate home and place and context within that. All of my work on democracy is premised, rightly or wrongly, I think rightly, on being a proceduralist. Procedures, processes. I think it's good that the deliberative Democrats over time have come to take that focus, I think, not necessarily influenced by me, but have begun to take that focus, not worrying so much on, is the outcome of a deliberation truthful? Is it the right answer? Well, how could we possibly know? But if it's a consensual answer, if it arises out of a process which can be characterized as fair, and I would add to your fair, Fernando, the words equal, open, inclusive, things that Chambers and Dreisek and others who write about these things, the kind of normative requirements that they emphasize. So I think a focus on process or procedure, a focus on systemic connections, deliberation finding its fair place, fair functioning and a fair place within it. These are all incredibly useful. It's been interesting how there's been a bit of a kickback against this deliberative wave in thinking about democracy. The old-fashioned way of thinking about deliberation was that you and I and others would not necessarily talk to other people. We would not necessarily deliberate with other citizens. We would just do a lot of thinking. We would talk to ourselves. So you hear the noisy traffic from central England going past my front door. If you look at Rawls, say Rawls after a while started to call himself a deliberative Democrat, and he had the notion of public reason. Yes, public reason played an important role in the later work of Rawls. But if you dig in to what he meant by public reason, which sounds like public deliberation, doesn't it? It sounds like reasoning. We're reasoning, we're discussing, we're deliberating together. But actually it wasn't. It was a conception of the individual citizen on his or her own, more or less, thinking really hard about what answers should be. Yeah. I think of Bob Gooden writing about, I quote, democratic deliberation within your head. Yes. So there were efforts to kind of rescue this thing back into the individualist, liberal, thinking citizen, autonomous citizen. Fortunately, those threads were not dominant. A couple of other quick comments, and I will come to the specific questions. I don't want to speak too long. In asking these 8 questions, I did not really provide answers deliberately. I think I've got my preferred way of approaching answers to many of them, but I did not want to recite my books to you. If you're patient enough and tolerant enough, you can read them. There's lots of good things to read out there, so they will have to compete with everything else. But it wasn't just Ivan and colleagues, your project that made me, where you use consultation, deliberation, direct, all these kind of adjectives were there. It's, when reading your project outline, I was struck by the fact that it shares that characteristic with many others I've read lately. Many others. Especially, by the way, I'm getting more engaged with people who don't come out of political science. They come out of design studies. They're in kind of arts faculties and they do design studies, and they're interested in systems design, and then they're very interested in democracy. So they, I write a book called Democratic Design, so I get, brought into the conversations. And they throw around, these are brilliant people who want to create brilliant apps for your phone that will help you brilliantly deliberate. They're ambitious and really interesting work, so we'll see how that goes. But they talk about deliberation, participation, consultation, co-creation, and other terms, almost like they're interchangeable. I don't think you quite did this, but that's what they do, and there's some sort of general commonality there. So that's the kind of thing. Rather than providing answers, I just thought you can't get past these sorts of questions. If all of these concepts are in play as you're thinking about a specific innovation in a specific place and evaluating it, or coming up with a design for something where there are democratic problems, or whatever it is, whatever the specific dilemma or case is, you can't get past these sorts of questions. You have to kind of figure your way through them. Gabriella, you're asking about representation, the tension, I think, between representation and deliberation on one level. I'm not sure if this answers the question, but if we look at deliberative forums, like specific ones like citizens' juries, citizens' assemblies, they can make a claim of representation which is unconventional in democratic politics, can't they? And they, depending how they're structured exactly, they can make a claim to be statistically or descriptively representative. Some people would describe the same thing as sociologically representative. So if you get with an assembly, you normally get around 100 people in a room, more or less randomly sampled. So you could more or less say, this bunch of people literally looks like the population. If 5% of the population are convicted criminals, then there will be 5% of convicted criminals in here. If X% of the population are teenagers, well, unusually in a political context, a formal one, you get a bunch of teenagers in here. Yeah? You might get 2 or 3 people who are over 90 years old in there. So it should look like the country. And that is both a troubling and quite a profound claim of representation, in a way, when you look at parliaments that are mostly dominated by middle-aged and older men, usually men from a dominant cultural or ethnic group. Yeah. Just what you can do with that is hard to say. I don't think the idea of statistical representation has really caught on amongst, apart from advocates of that particular approach to deliberative democracy. Alejandro, you emphasize cultures. My work on this is similar to some others, but I hate this metaphor, but I'm going to use it anyway. Everybody uses this. Have you noticed when they're in English anyway? I've been on a journey. Have you noticed everybody goes on a journey these days? Yeah. So I've been doing this for a long time, that is in academia and researching democracy and so on. I started out as a kind of political theorist who thought you could make general normative conclusions about democracy, rights, freedom, and other things. I no longer believe that. And the most agonizing part of my work on the book Democratic Design, published earlier this year, was trying to deal with culture and context. Cultures are very specific. They are linguistic cultures. They are colonial or non-colonial cultures. There are specific city and urban and regional cultures. They are also to do with religion and other aspects of identity. And of course, this is a cliche, every one of those micro cultures is unique in some way. How can you take that into account when you've got this universal, cross-cultural concept of democracy or other concepts like representation, deliberation, which seem to operate in a different universe in their generality? And the answer, is it an answer? My effort to provide an answer was to try to describe, to find language to describe what it means to pay real attention to the specifics of place, the specifics of identity. So when I talk about context and design for context, that is thinking about democratic structures and reforms in context, I don't know anyone else who's quite tried it as much as I have, and I don't think I've got it right either. But there's a segment around, I don't know, chapter 4 in that book where I struggle with this issue. But you are, which is a way of saying you are absolutely right about the filtering through quite unique aspects of culture that thinkers about democracy and would-be democratic reformers have to take on board, which is incredibly difficult and you can't get it right. But being conscious of it and attempting to construct methodologies that reflect your consciousness of it is at least some sort of step in the right direction, arguably. Luis Manuel, you asked about technologies. I don't feel very equipped to answer the question, but it's a really good question. I mentioned a moment ago that some people I'm engaging with, designers, people coming out of design thinking, are very engaged with apps, special kinds of apps that bring people together in specific groups, enable deliberations and discussions, facilitate participation. I think these are in their relatively early days. We will see what the technologists come up with. Some of these groups involve computer scientists who are trying to bring artificial intelligence to play in fostering deliberation and participation in different ways. I'm certainly not an expert in that. I try to understand what they're saying and what they're planning and what their dreams are. So there could be a lot going on in the fostering and facilitation through innovative digital means of citizen information, engagement, and deliberation. Let's see what happens there. I guess the other side of that coin is And there's been a lot more talk about, you know, the monopoly of Facebook and the impact on driving people into ever narrower, sometimes conspiracy theory laden rabbit holes. And I suspect that in the next decade or so in the US, I don't know what the situation is like in Mexico. I guess some of the problems around Facebook's dominance and the use of its algorithms and their political impact is probably similar across the globe, I suspect. There will be major reform coming, but it will take a battle. It will take a huge battle with Facebook and others. Will the right-wing populists and their algorithmically supported conspiracies win the day before then? Well, we live in interesting times for politics, and we will see. I could say a lot more because people have said and asked a lot more, and I know those are only partial responses. I think to you, Gabriella, in particular, that was a kind of partial response. So come back and hit me with the question again if you wish. And Ivan, I'm keen to hear your thoughts as the convener of the project that in some ways we're circling around in our discussion here. Yeah.
Well, first, okay.
Okay, thank you, Professor Saward. Ivan, we still have, well, 1 minute left. I don't know if we can extend the time, but in any case, I'll leave that minute to you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank you, to say for all these questions. All these were provocative questions, of course, and this will be a motive for us to keep discussing and studying and reflect about all these topics. And I just want to say a very short comment about what we were doing during these months in our seminary. We are not we are more than a deliberative believers. I mean, I think that we understand that we would like to see deliberation as something that is in the real world, and that is the reason that we are trying to map and to assess deliberation in a specific process. And we also think that in Mexico we need to that citizens must be involved in collective decisions, but we are also seeing that many people are thinking about just electoral processes as synonym of democracy. So we would like to go beyond that conception, and we think that deliberation would be a good conceptual frame to understand some real processes. And we use a term that an author has called Deliberative Timbre. And of course, this is a metaphor. And we think that it could be a very good way to understand that we want to see how deliberation would be could be incorporated or involved in some political processes. And now we're using those concepts, and we are going to analyze, in this case, direct democracy processes that we usually think that those are not deliberative, but we think that, and of course in a normative way, that this would be that those process would has the timbre, the deliberative timbre, and in that and it does and would be better than just to go to the day of the vote day and to decide something in a direct democracy processes. And this is my comment about the project and about what we were working on. Thank you, Michael.
Could I make a quick comment in return? Sylvia, are we going to be cut off from the airwaves immediately?
I don't know, Ivan. Are we going to be cut from the system or not? Yes.
No, not necessarily, but
okay, then you can go ahead and make a comment, please, Mike.
Thank you. Just to take a moment. I mean, thank you, Ivan. That's good. That helps me to kind of. Fortunately, it fits with what you wrote, which is great. And you have a small team, I guess, who are engaged with different institutions and citizen groups in the city for this work. So that sounds very good, and I wish you well, and I look forward to kind of hearing more of the results. A quick comment that connects with something else that Fernando was saying earlier. Fernando, you were worried about who gets to set the theme, who gets to set the conversation. You were citing Goebbels, yeah. So, and I guess one theoretical, anyway, response to that worry, which is a genuine worry, who sets the agenda for discourses, for deliberations, and so on, is, well, let's have lots of different centers of power that cannot be dominated by a single theme. Maybe federalism needs radical rethinking. I sometimes think that the most neglected principle of democracy, certainly in the small world of democratic theory, but sometimes in the much larger world of politics, is decentralization and the creation of effective plural power centers. I know there are mixed questions in Mexico about the degree of political autonomy of the different states. Of course, some federal states are more centralized, some are more decentralized, but local government as well. I mean, this is a critical issue for who gets access to power, where they get access to power, how many people can get access in different places. It just doesn't get written about. It's a curious thing. Well, I shouldn't be saying this. I should be sitting here writing about it, shouldn't I, if I say this? So it does prompt a question, though, with Ivan and your team, Ivan, that if you don't want the processes in Mexico City to be dominated, when people think about democracy, to be dominated by the vote every now and then, but have to ongoing processes of consultation, deliberation, and to think about those in specific ways that might work for people in the city. I guess a question to ask towards the end of the project is, could this be replicated if there were kind of multiple places across? Is this a Mexico City thing? Could this be other Mexican cities thing? What would that translation, transfer, or replication involve? If it's worth doing here, maybe it's worth doing there and there and there, not just because that's a nice thing, but because it's that ideal of replication and multiplication would be at the very heart of the goals of the project. That is, points of access for citizens to decision-making. So you may not only be doing work in a specific context, you're certainly doing that, and culture and context and place and architecture and all that stuff matters. But you may also be implicitly producing a replicable model. You may be producing a Mexican replicable model of citizen access or something. I'm just making the words up. For multiple centers, for a more radically pluralistic politics in terms of power centers.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Soward. I think we have gone over the time already. Yeah, 6 minutes. I think we need to cut the session. I know we could go on for hours, and I would love to. I didn't place my questions because I'm not formally a member of the seminar, but I've got a list for our next time, Professor Soward.
Okay. And by the way, I hope that my conceiving this as fairly informal and not giving a formal paper was okay. And by the same token, I'm happy to come back for a chat some other time, if you like. The conversation is interesting, and I'm certainly interested to hear the progress that you guys make with the project. I don't know what time span you're dealing with. Is this a kind of 1 year, 2 year project?
Yeah, it's for 1 year and maybe 1 year more.
Okay.
Yeah, but we'd love to join again.
Okay, that's great. Yeah. So sorry, Sylvia, for interrupting you, but I thought I would say that.
No, it's okay. I'm sure, and we all hope this conversation is not over and it's not finished. And yeah, I'm sure you're going to be invited again to the seminar, right, Fernando and Ivan?
Well, I have only made comments to Ivan's project. I'm not really a member of the seminar, but yes, I would love to be in this kind of conversation with Michael and with you, Sylvia, certainly.
Okay, well then we'll close up this session, thanking everyone for having attended, and especially Professor Soward and Professor Castaños for their comments on Ivan's project.
Thank you.
Matilde has shown her
Matilde, you'd like to say something, please.
Hello, Matilda. Nice to see you. Okay. Good luck, everybody. And Sylvia and Fernando, I'll be talking to you soon about related projects. All the best, everybody.
Okay.
All the best. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.